Hi everyone, I hope your day has been amazing so far. But get ready because it's about to get even better with the stories I have lined up for you next. Just wait until you hear how these eyewitnesses dealt with what they say was the most intense experience of their lives. While you're here, also please like, share, and subscribe to put a big smile on my face. Thank you. Now let's get into the stories. I did a really stupid thing and fell asleep in a boat on the bayou. Considering that the gators and croc population was up in those days, that was an especially stupid thing for me to do. But I had been drinking and the swamp sounds had been so soothing, I felt succumbed to the relaxation and conked out. I woke up to the sight of what looked like logs with eyes drifting all around me. I knew that if I started rowing, those logs would beeline me and I'd be in for a world of trouble. I hoped that they would go away on their own, but that turned out to be a very foolish hope. The exact opposite happened. One of them got tired of waiting and started carving V-shaped ripples as it headed straight for me. Now, maybe it was the liquor or the hangover from it, but I watched as that crocodile or alligator or whatever it is comes straight for me, and I was ready to go. But then there was a ripple on the surface and some bubbles, and the alligator or whatever was gone. Stranger yet, the others started fleeing from my location. I was expecting the one submerged alligator to launch itself out of the water and slam itself into my boat, but instead it emerged on the far side of the bank, and it looked like it was scrambling for its life. I kid you not, a large black clawed hand reached out of the water and grabbed its tail and yanked it back under the water with such incredible force that this thing stood no chance. Now, I don't know how much you know about the autonomy of an alligator, but the tail ain't the weakest part of their body by far. The simple fact that this animal was wrestled back into the water by its tail with one hand at that raised some serious questions about what sort of thing or person was manhandling it. A few moments later, I could see that there was no man doing the manhandling. The chaotic splashing drifted over to the bank, where I can only describe it as a towering monster that looked like a wolf, coated in slime, emerged with an iron grip on the croc's dead body. Thrash as it may, there was just no escaping, and it was one of the bigger alligators I'd ever seen. For a moment, I thought the whole thing would turn around with the alligator it had in its jaws and the large head of a monster, but the thing took its two massive claws and grabbed either side of the mouth and pulled it open very wide. I could hear the jaws snap, and I knew right away that the animal had been broken. This hulking wolf monster then proceeded to bash its prey against a tree in rage. Ever see a croc had its brains beaten out? I did that day. It was as terrific as it was terrifying. Even though I stood to be lunched just a few minutes earlier, I couldn't help but feel sorry. It literally had no fighting chance and might as well have been a puppy in the clutches of an eagle. If you'd met me, you'd see that my hands shake. It's why my voice shakes, too. I came so close to death, and then I watched death incarnate in the flesh rise up and break a predator that I feared as if it was just a mere toy. That is why I stay out of the bayous. I've heard tales of what people described as hulking-sized werewolves, but I always just thought it was a wives' tale. Silly ghost stories to scare kids that are told around the campfire. That is, until I saw it for myself. I was more amazed at the sheer size of this animal or creature or thing. It was kind of like a human, except nearly 8 to 9 feet tall, with a massive Arnold Schwarzenegger-like body, covered in thick, long black hair, with a massive head of that of a wolf. To say it was a werewolf, well, I don't believe in people changing into wolves at the full moon, but aesthetically this thing lined up with what many consider to be a werewolf, except it looked much fiercer and hulking than I could have ever imagined. That's why I now permanently stay out of the swamps. I know those tales are real. I don't know if they're demons or if they're living animals or whatever they are. I prefer to consider them guardians of the swamp. And I guess that day, however you want to look at it, this thing was looking out for me, or so I'd like to think. I was on a fishing trip with my uncle. I normally am not up for that sort of thing, but come on, the man was dying of cancer. He had spent most of his life trying to get me to like fishing, and he had all but failed. So his wishes were that I would go fishing with him and at least pretend that I was enjoying myself. I couldn't say no to something like that, especially under those circumstances. I met my uncle on his own property. He owned the better part of 3 smaller lakes in Tennessee. Well, they weren't really lakes. They were more like oversized ponds, not recognized as lakes by any stretch of the matter. It was the kind of land that you could just live off of and just forget about any concept of an outside world with cares and problems and troubles. That was pretty much what my uncle had done. He got wrapped up in spending all of his free time lost in the fantasy world of fishing until the reality of the disease came calling, leading his mortality on a leash. And somewhere in all of that, one of the first things he had thought of was me. So, how do I say no to something like that? We pushed off and got further away from shore. I had forgotten just how much land my uncle had owned. My uncle sat back in the little rowboat and tipped his hat over his eyes and fell asleep. I shook my head and ceased pretending to be interested, whether my fishing line was really catching anything or not. I loved the man, but the business of becoming a vegetable while waiting for a fish to take bait just really wasn't my thing. I was lost in the restless daydream when my line not only went taut, but the entire rod was yanked out of the boat. It took me 1 second too long to respond, and the whole thing was now lost in the water. I couldn't imagine what sort of thing was big enough to take away my uncle's equipment so quickly, and with so much force. Unfortunately, I wouldn't have to imagine very long. Somewhere in the cloak of the mist, not hugging the water, I heard what sounded to be a great deal of splashing. Then I heard growling, mingled with a yelping sound. Something was in pain, and it didn't sound like a fish. Then came the very frustrated howl as 2 points of dim light danced somewhere in the gray void. I did that dumb thing, and I began to row towards it, thinking of the possibility of coming across a raving lunatic or a pack of wild animals that could be panicked and dangerous if they were caught up in the fishing line. I had hoped that the 2 points of light were an indicator of people, but they were far, far from it. Well, they turned out to be eyes. It was like something from an old cartoon that I used to watch when I was a kid. A towering monster. A wolf thing that had gotten the hook sunk into its body and was having a dickens of a time getting it out. Its clawed fingers weren't suited for the fine manipulation it would take to work a small bit sturdy hook out of its body. And it was getting now stuck in the line. The thing was visibly angry and perhaps distraught. The sight of it alone was terrifying, and had I been more attuned to animals, I might have had the mind to help it if it didn't stand more than 7 feet tall and walk around like you or I. What kind of wolf creature walks around on its hind legs? Werewolves, that's what. But I had absolutely no preparation in my mind for ever running into such a thing. So I was speechless and directionless. I ended up rowing away quietly, hoping that it wouldn't catch our scent or come after us. It bolted off into the woods with the line still wrapped around it. I had a hell of a time explaining to my uncle what happened to his fishing gear. or actually even clarifying that this thing clearly looks strong not to break the line, but that didn't seem to be a problem. The hook seemed to be lodged somewhere in its chest. I don't know how or what, but it seemed like it was having a really hard time digging it out, being halfway into the water and covered in the mist. And I don't know why it bolted away or why it didn't come after us. Either way, it was completely and absolutely frightening. I'm just glad my uncle didn't see it. The poor old man would have probably had a heart attack. I'm an adult now, but the story that I'm about to tell you, although it happened when I was a kid, will never leave me. It's one of the scariest encounters I've ever had, and for years it's kept me awake at night. I was 10 at the time, my brothers were 6 and 13, and we, along with our parents, were off on a wonderful adventure. Well, that's how it felt to us. In reality, we were in a truck pulling a trailer in which we thought we were going to spend a few days driving around, finding fun stuff to do in the day and cool places to park at night. It was on the way back from one of the fun places, a carnival where I'd finally gotten to experience some of the big kid rides, and while we were on the lookout for some place to camp at night, when it happened. It was early evening, around 8:30 at night, and since it was summertime, it was still pretty light outside. My little brother was fast asleep, having been worn out from all the fun, and I remember thinking I would likely also doze straight off as soon as my dad found somewhere to park. And that's when there was a really, really loud bang which came from the very rear of the trailer. I remember my dad stopping and cursing, and my mom simply insisting that he get out and check it, as possibly a deer had run into the back. After all, she was a real sucker for any animal, stray or not, so she didn't want to think that it could be lying out there hurt. My dad opened the door and told us all to stay in the truck while he took a look. We did, but of course we scooted around so we could see exactly what was happening. After a few minutes, he came back to the window to talk to Mom, and I remember he looked kind of puzzled. "There's a huge dent in the back of the trailer, but I don't see an animal anywhere. I can't think of a single animal that could make a dent like that and just walk away." Of course, we all wanted to go out and see that, since this was the 70s and there was far less traffic on the roads. And we were also in the middle of nowhere. It was highly unlikely another vehicle would come steaming through, so we all went around back to the trailer, except my brother Jimmy, who was somehow managing to sleep through the entire show, and we oohed and awed at the size of the dent. My dad may have used a few more expletives here on what on earth could have caused it. And that was when we heard the very, very low-pitched growl. Immediately, my mother told us to get back in the car and lock the doors. She came back in too, while Dad stayed for just a moment. He wanted to know what the cause of the damage was from. And Mom was yelling, "Jerry, get back in the car!" But for some reason, my dad moved closer to the side of the road where the growling was coming from. We were all turned around in our seats to be able to see, and that's when we saw this thing. Emerging from the trees at the side of the road came a rather enormous-looking creature, and it was taller and broader than my dad and covered in this gross, thick black hair. It stood up on 2 legs like a person and had long, dangly arms. And then there was the head. The head was huge. It looked way out of proportion with the body, even though that was massive too. Oh, and it was the head of a dog. That's right. This thing that came out of the trees growling at my dad made a huge dent in the back of the trailer with no damage to itself, and was a virtual giant standing on 2 legs. Needless to say, we learned a few more curse words, and Dad yelled and ran back to the car. He slammed the door and put his foot down on the gas pedal. Bam, we were out of there. dusty. I kept staring back at the side of the road. Seatbelts weren't a really big thing back then. And that thing just stood there watching until we rounded a nearby bend and we couldn't see it anymore. We drove and drove that whole night way further than we intended to. But my dad wanted to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. I sure as hell don't know exactly what it was or how something like that even existed in our world. But with God as my witness, I will tell you it was real, and I will never forget it.